Welcome to the new season of the 2 Months Review. I think it's 17th season. I forgot to double check that. In which we are doing 2 books this time. We're doing Never Did the Fire by Diamela Eltit and Catching Fire by Daniel Hahn, which is a companion diary to his translation of this. And for anyone who's watching for the first time, this is a weekly podcast where we break down these quote-unquote difficult books, talk about them in sections, analyze them, have some fun. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and I'm joined as always by Brian Wood, author of Joytime Killbox.
Howdy, happy to be here.
And Katie Whittemore, translator extraordinaire.
Thanks.
How you doing, you two?
Good.
It's been a while.
How are you
It's
guys?
been a while.
It's nice to see you both.
Yeah, I just got to Latvia this morning, so things are a bit off. Still figuring out how to get the Wi-Fi to work with my computer. Also adjust to the time change and the fact that every single thing here is pickled. Straight up. We went to lunch, got Alex penne pasta, and it came with a side of pickles, which is something I don't think I've ever seen before in my life. But like, cool, whatever you want.
I don't see the problem. I don't see the problem in any of that.
I just think it's not necessarily a problem. It's just kind of weird, you know. Like there's nothing that doesn't. I don't think a side of pickles goes with pasta. I don't think that's a tradition.
All your food comes from a jar.
So one other thing I want to mention before we start, aside from the fact that I'm in a very echoey room, but I can leave this room in a few minutes, and hopefully that will help out the sound for anyone listening to this, is that we did launch a Patreon before this season. So if you go to patreon.com/2month-review, you can help support the podcast at a number of different levels, including ones where you get a shout out or access to a Discord server where you can talk about books or translation or whatever. There's also levels in which some people have done in which they get books from my personal library. So I've mailed them out to some people. Whoever got Fable by William Faulkner, I will tell you that I sent you that book because I can't read it. Because the print's too small. So
You're too old.
In a way, I'm slowly offloading things that are like make me feel shitty about myself. And then the other levels include where we'll make fun of one of your books live on air, whatever book you want us to make fun of. Primarily that will be Brian, I believe. You can also, if you give it a high enough level, you can join us live on the air and get some sort of TMR merchandise, which we're still working out. There are 2 ideas for a t-shirt, one of which was roundly rejected by one member of our
Who rejected my ideas? Who could that be?
I wonder
Guilty.
who had the foresight to think that we might be tasteless.
Saving your asses.
Like, I don't want to be canceled with the first piece of merchandise. One piece of merchandise that I still think is a solid one, which is the Chad W. Post Bullied Me t-shirt, which is a weird reflection on when the whole Lost story went down and we sold all those copies of Third Policeman, and it was on the show for like a millisecond. And then when we went onto the forums for Lost, there was someone who just said, Chad W. Post lied to me, was their only comment. Which I still think is a good gravestone marker. But so go on there, donate. It'll help support everyone, including getting microphones and all that good stuff. So anyways, let's get going. What did you guys think of this? Are either of you familiar with Diamela Eltit?
I shook my head no for those that aren't watching.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the figure of Diamela Eltit. I haven't read any of her work. I might have read some like selected fragments in graduate school, but I haven't studied her formally, and I've never read anything, full length of her.
I have zero going into it, completely virgin nothing. I love, similar to the way Daniel was translating it, just first read. Love it. I like no expectations, nothing, just
Along for the ride.
Yeah.
Just doing it. Do you
you read her?
What do you remember about her, Katie, as a figure?
Not that much, Chad.
Good. Cool. She's Chilean.
Just honestly, not that much. I mean, she's Chilean. I know
she's Chilean. That is a key.
She's considered an experimental figure, experimental writer. I know that she has a reputation for producing difficult literature.
Is it because
I know she's award winning.
She's won a lot of awards,
Yeah.
including the FIL, the Phil Award in 2021, and the Carlos Fuentes Prize in 2020, National Prize for Literature in Chile in 2018. So even like recently, but I always thought of her. I have read her. So when I worked at Quail Ridge Books in North Carolina in the early 2000s, we had the 3 translations that were out at that point in time. The big one being Illuminata, which is her debut novel and is like groundbreaking in Chilean literature because it really just upended the idea of conventional narratives, and it really is an experimental tour de force. Got her a lot of attention. Was written under the dictatorship. Is very like political and very strongly, stridently feminist in the sense of like, and I'm going to use my favorite word, in the sense that it like deconstructs the gaze placed on female bodies and on their cells. The word gaze appears in this book no fewer than 400 times. When I reread it, it's on almost every paragraph.
It's your favorite.
Insane.
Dad, what year was that published?
It was published in Spanish in, oops, that's not on here. This came out in 1997. Oh, 83 is when it came out in Spanish.
And
97
then 97. And who translated it?
Ronald Christ translated it, and it was published by Lumen Books, which he was running, I believe. And then there was another translation called The Fourth World that someone did. It's in the preview post. I can't remember. I don't want to look it up right now. Which was done by Nebraska. It's very thin, also experimental, about 2 unborn twins inside the womb. Sacred Cow is a more sexual, provocative book that was translated by Amanda Hopkinson for Serpent's Tail. And then Ronald Christ and Helen Lane, rest in peace, they did another book of hers together. I'm blanking on what the name of it is right now, but they published that through Lumen as well. And I think it came out like right after Helen Lane passed away, and was maybe the last book that Lumen Books ever published. So she had these 4 books, all from like 97 through like 2005. And then 15, 17 years go by, and then this book came out. But like in my mind, she's always been like kind of a relic of like the 1970s experimental writing scene in Latin America, especially dealing with like dictatorship and that sort of stuff. And then it was surprising to see this come out and to see that she's had many more works in between, won all these awards, all that kind of stuff. But that's my general framework for this. I have marked, so I reread this book to prep for Never Did the Fire.
Illuminata, for those who are listening, not watching you.
Yeah. So do you want to know about the title? There's a lot of interesting stuff in this book, not from the book itself. The book itself is fine, but it's also, I don't understand it. It's beyond my comprehension level. But there is an introduction by her that I want to refer to when we're talking today. And then there's an afterword by Ronald Christ in which he talks about her and talks specifically about how to translate the title, which is Lumperica in Spanish, and doesn't really work in any number of ways that he was trying to work with it, because he said like it fuses the German lumpen, a word more commonly used in Spanish, where Marxist terminology is commonplace, than in current American English, and perica, which denotes everything from babe and chick to an undetermined person, a sort of Boulevard Jane Doe, a prostitute too. So he tried to come up with various ways of doing this. He was also concerned that like it was losing the Erica as like the America sound to it, like that even though the word didn't mean that. But then he went along this line of error, errant, erratic, errata, all leading to aberrant, and came up with Illuminata as his version of the character's name and of the title, which I mentioned because the title comes up in Danny's book for this week as well. So it's interesting to see both of them having to play with this very specific thing. This one maybe more than the other. The one other thing that I wanted to frame this with, okay, it's not her marginality. Maybe it is the marginality. I'll find it. Anyways, you guys what are your first impressions? Let's start with her book, I guess.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna ask if we'll start with her. Go ahead, Brian. You've been quiet.
Sure. It reads very fast. It's lean and it's very terse. But to me, it strikes me as very poetic. it feels much like especially the very first chapter has like a prose poem feel to it, and in the way it sounds, and the way the sentences hit.
Yeah, I'm interested too, sort of in the like you said, it does read really quickly, and it's less. I was expecting, just based on my sort of little knowledge of her, I was expecting something like a bit more impenetrable, like more abstract or more ambiguous. I think there are some sections where I see that, but I was like kind of pleasantly surprised to be able to like follow it.
Yeah.
At least
same.
in the beginning, I was worried. I was worried that it was going to be like really difficult to read, but I thought this was I think it just sort of, it starts off and it moves rather quickly.
I can give you a contrast really quick between these two books, and that might tie into what you're saying. So here's just a random page I just opened to. Oh God, any one of these are great. This is just a random page of Illuminata, page 83, part 4, chapter 4, part 3, Her Remnants. Between the years of her birth and death, she was able / to limit herself to 3 occupations, these being conditioned by historic events that determine incidences by appearances. During those years, she divided herself between fiction and the fiction of her occupations. That way she succeeded in striking a balance among the fiction desired by externals and others she did not recognize as such, and that resulting from both. This last she designated her own. You're nodding, Katie. You get it. You got it. You're on it.
No, I'm just nodding. I'm nodding so
like,
that so I want you to have feedback. I'm nodding at your delivery.
I'm not even listening because I'm just thinking again, it's like, oh, here's Chad reading a section of book to lose everybody that's trying to listen and pay attention. Way to go. 12 minutes in.
Hey,
okay.
You made it 12 minutes. You got the Patreon pitch in. Who cares?
Yeah, we want to get those Patreon supporters. Let's
Yeah,
exactly. But I think that's a really wonderful example because, like, yeah, that's like, all right, I'll have to reread this again and consider what the context of each word means in the sentence. Whereas this one, it's just very concrete and full of images. Like word 1, page 1. We are lying in bed, surrendered to the legitimacy of a rest we deserve. Mm-hmm. We are guests lying in the night, sharing. I feel your body folded against my folded back, perfect together. The curve is the shape that holds us best because we can harmonize and dissolve our differences. My stature and yours, the weight, the arrangement of bones of mouths. Like it's very, it's just poetic. Yeah. It's concrete. It's
really put it. There's such rhythm.
Yeah.
There's such rhythm to the text and the repetition of, I ask you,
mm-hmm.
And you say, and mm-hmm. I ask you again. And so it's interesting because we don't know, we have this really strong sort of very, very close and sort of visceral first person voice. We're there with them in bed. It's, their bodies. So we're starting from like a real corporeal place. We don't know who they are. We don't know if that first person, we don't know yet if that first person is female or male.
Corporeal Place was the name of an emo band I was in college.
Yeah.
What was?
Corporeal Place.
Really?
No.
But it is a
like,
perfect
oh my
emo
God,
band.
what a coincidence. What a coincidence.
Get some eyeliner on and moan about your feelings, bud.
Your corporeal. Your body. The curve is the shape that holds us best.
And here we go. All the audience comes right back in for Katie's.
Put my hand on your hip and I shake you once, twice fast, obvious.
No, but yeah, like I was warned that this is going to be experimental. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult, and like you said, impenetrable. And it starts off just like very, I don't know. It's kind of like glowing, arresting, like very beautiful at the beginning and fast. It was a really nice start.
But we know something's weird.
Oh yeah.
right?
James,
We have
we
hints.
don't,
We have
and like
hints
the,
of. Go ahead, Chad.
no, you go.
No, I was going to say, so you start to see like, all right, well, something's really not quite right with the memory. There's something here about memory and about time.
Yeah.
That doesn't, we know that these are people who are sort of like lost in time or adrift in some way.
Right.
Well, how hard is it to cook rice? That really
Well, the rice.
threw me off.
And how hard is it to eat the rice? That also
Yeah.
seems to be problematic.
Yeah.
I like eating rice is problematic. It's everywhere. I feel like that
The
rice
eating
is
of the
all
rice.
over that bed.
The eating of a rice is a big problem.
I do feel like maybe I should go on an all rice aesthetic diet so I can remain hungry and driven.
Yeah, if you are
to be the best revolutionary I can be.
Exactly. You need to be, only the good militants, the best militants are hungry militants.
So a stranger sees you reading this, you're on chapter 1, and say, what it's about? It's these two people like eating rice, but like they don't like the rice. Oh, what
Yeah.
Franco died 100 years, 1,000 years ago. I don't know.
Yeah.
One or. So that's the thing that like I wanted to build off of for a second,
Mm-hmm.
is that when I talked to Danny in London about doing this TMR, and we talked, I don't remember if we address it in the bonus section that comes at the end of this episode that you can listen to on the podcast, but he was saying that the biggest problem for him was how Diamela Eltit particularly loves ambiguity, like at every level, and that her fiction is meant to be ambiguous. So again, like from her introduction to Illuminata, she says, I'm interested in and continue to be excited by the ambiguity that can be generated by literary meanings. That opening displayed by some books and cracking the monolith of completed stories. I see myself seduced by certain micro tales that attract to themselves innumerable gestures, rictus, and aesthetic simulacra that permit the rebellious circulation of strategic fragments oppressed by official cultures. The literary field where I find my calling, equally as producer and as reader, takes in fragmentariness and the superimposition of voices, views incompleteness as well as a narrative tactic, like a metaphor. I mean to say that it even views the strategy of strategy as the setting for writing, in an act of liberating meanings and of protecting against the ideologizing of literature.
Mm.
So this does start, I agree with both of you, that it starts like completely like readable, straight in a lot of ways, but I have a feeling that it's going to veer and maybe not be as like experimentally strange as some of the Illuminata, but that there is like an attempt, if you attempt to make the narrative fit, that becomes more problematic as time goes on. But I could be wrong. That's just my hypothesis.
That's interesting.
You mentioned this.
Oh, no, go ahead.
You mentioned this earlier, Katie, in a different conversation, but where are they? Because the Franco thing threw me off too, as being like a Spanish. I mean, I feel like this is set in Spain, but.
Well, this was really interesting because when we get to talking about about the diary, I think some of that question was answered for me in. Let me just see. Oh yeah, in the second chapter, the Stalinist extremist crazy killer bitch. In the Spanish, Danny notes that it's frentista. One of the words he translates it as, I think, extremist, because the frentista wouldn't make any sense, calling her a frontist wouldn't make any sense, in English, right? But they're talking about, a political party, very left-wing political movement in Chile. So, so Franco dies in 1975. Pinochet comes to power in 73. So there's an overlap, of 2 years of these two dictatorships. And I think we'll find, okay, so I have two things in mind about about why she opens with the death of Franco. And one thing I think, oh shit, I had two and now I have none. They both fluttered out of my head.
Welcome to live broadcasting.
One of the things that I think is interesting, and then maybe we'll find out more about how because I don't know necessarily that political history and what the influence of the Franco dictatorship was on Pinochet, or on, in the fall of the Franco dictatorship, and the transition to democracy in Spain, started to occur like the end of around 1973, which is when Franco started to be like too unwell to govern, right?
Yeah.
The caudillo was like becoming weak. And so he named a successor, who was one of whom was assassinated, and there was another successor. And then Franco does die in this really sort of like, pitiful and uninspiring way, just like of, old age and heart attacks in bed. And at the end of his life, he was, I think, perceived as like a very sort of weak figure in that death scene, right? Of him, surrounded by his, admirers and his weeping children, widows and children, and all of that. So I think that, in the beginning of this book, there's hints of a sort of like decadence, like a decline in, obviously, in Spanish fascism. At the same time, it's in the early stages of a Chilean fascist regime. So,
Right.
so I do think that's interesting. The other thing I wanted to point out about the narrator's like troubling concern with when was it, what day was it? What she says is that she wants to. All right, on page 2, I think this is important, because I think here what we're going to see, I'm expecting that we're going to see quite a bit about like trauma and memory in this book. But I'm looking on page 2 in the last paragraph, and when I ask you when, you're breathing agitated, you move towards the edge of the bed. I don't know, you answer me. Be quiet, woman. Turn over. Go to sleep. A precise day of a precise year, but which is no part of any order. A scene that's detached, inarticulate now, in which we were smoking, focused, so committed to that first cell of ours, while you, precociously wise, etc., etc., etc. So, there's sort of like this yearning or like longing for precision and exactitude, and being able to pin down a moment that is breaking apart before her, and unable to articulate that moment in which we were smoking. And this is really interesting, because then on page 4, she's she goes through all of this stuff about like, well, when was the Franco, and dying of everything, practically no organs, etc., etc. And then she says at the end of the first paragraph on page 4, how could I have forgotten the year, a year you remember but won't tell me, to prevent me from settling the matter of the cigarette? So there's this, it quickly draws us into like a very, very personal moment and personal realm between these two people, and the smoking of a cigarette at a meeting of like, their quote unquote extremist cell. And so we're coming from like this really, really large world event, and trying to, I guess, like pin down the personal using that frame, using like the calendar, or the clock of history, and of Franco's death as that moment. But it's all very much tied to the personal, which I think is really cool.
That's what I was thinking too, of like the idea of personal time. In fact, of like, she references things like, we were smoking. I was smoking then. That was that point in time. Like the personal time that one can remember and sort of mark things by. So there is like the only real, aside from them being in this bed, not eating rice kind of, and I guess like she is a woman, but since it's referred to as a woman there, we could assume that that voice is a female. Aside from her sort of thinking back to when did Franco die, when did this event happen where he called me a Stalinist extremist bitch, there is some sort of part with their cell where there's a debate between the person that she's in bed with and the group. He's one of the, or they is one of the leaders of this group, wanting to do more analysis and less direct action in the like revolutionary cell development, wherever this might be, whenever this might be, and that her vote sort of sways things in the other way, or her talk sort of sways things in the other way and dissolves their cell in the end.
Right. And
that's like the plot,
you know,
point.
and yeah,
that's
exactly.
Like the plot point.
But that's a betrayal, right? Potentially ideologically and also very personally, that, you know, we can assume that they're a couple. Yeah, I really thought that was cool. Like that, the way that this is written reminds me of other things I've seen, which we can bring in, I guess, at some point. But the idea of like the reproducing the kind of debate language, you know, in this really personal realm, I think is so interesting. Like there's, you know, was Franco a Nazi or a fascist? Right. You know, and it's like, well, these are the points. And he's like, no, basically, like, you need to be more rigorous in your category. Yeah. And so it's like, there's
fucking Marxists all the time, man.
There's this decline.
They're all like,
yeah, I like that.
You know what book it actually reminds me of the most? I think, and nobody will have read this because nobody will have had a chance to, but is Luis Guidasolo's Antagony. The first volume of that is set in then the 50s, 60s of the Franco era in Spain, in Catalonia, and has a lot of students who are part of these sorts of groups and of like trying to figure out what to do, what actions to take, where they pamphlet things, how they like protest, and also all the fear of that. But they have a lot of conversations that are very similar to this in terms of that kind of, what do we do? How do we run around? What are the words? What's the right word? What's the right this? What's the right that? It's very interesting.
I do have one thing that I just was thinking of, and when you were mentioning the transition between political powers, and like this idea of when she's talking about rice, and it's the same as bread, and like bread is a stand-in for life, for sustenance, just us existing, right?
And the body of Christ.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There you go. We're back. Revelation. Yeah, but it made me think of like, so this is the rice I'm given, and whatever I do with it, we try to eat it, but we don't like it and we spit it out. And it's like this idea of like, no matter what you're given, like it's going to be distasteful and like it's shoved down your throat to sustain you, and that's and I feel like there might be something there with the way it's talking about blocked throat and then spitting it out and then the disgust of it.
I know. And what do we make of this weird scene where she's describing, and this is like so yucky, talking about when he squeezes the piece of cheese he holds up the piece of cheese, squeezes it between his fingers, pierces it with his nails. It's like, oh, that's weird. You know, that's really weird.
No, there's just the way with how lean it is and how precise the imagery is. Like it's obviously there for a reason, but like with like page 8, we eat precisely briefly. Rice is related to bread, both fulfilling their role of providing us with sleep and relief. We eat bread and rice. I always pair the rice the same way. The rice, it's common form, the necessary cooking that does require a certain concentration. It's bad. The rice is bad. When it ends up overcooked or almost raw, it's repulsive grains that more than once have gone down the wrong way. Yes, you cough and the grains come out of your mouth until, you know.
Well, and this is interesting too, like on page 11. So I think we're starting to get, you know, she's doing something really cool with the food. That's like that's starting to reveal something about each of these characters and their, like, you know, their makeup and their difference. And like when on page 11, when she's saying, well, there's two places I think where this comes together. You know, there's this sort of dichotomy of the, you know, austerity and excess, right? And so when she's saying, you know, the hunger allows us to do concrete and sustained work. You hated drowsiness. You preferred, even in its discomfort, hunger. I would confirm this for myself. I did it when I surrendered myself to the glorification of foodstuffs, to their fatty excess. You hated it, fat, the fatty body and its shine. A body rounded by layers of a liquefied fattiness, that produced the listlessness that deferred agility, that agility you demanded of the cell, and which, if it was not up to your expectations, you would have to remake with other bodies that were hungry and energetic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, and it's a real sort of like military sense there too, of that leanness and that trimming of the fat, and of sort of like, you know, a bodily hunger and agility that, you know, and if you're not in line with that, like a new cell that will have to be dissolved and something else created with leaner bodies, you know, more, I don't know. I think that's interesting. And so, you know, we have this sense of her as being, first of all, the female. Second of all, the one who, from what we can tell, is in a caregiving role for this person of like, you know, making the food and feeding him. And then, you know, we have this indication of that she would be tending towards excess. And this is a person who, and then, you know, the partner is very, very austere politically.
Even the words like swallowing, you pointed out and about like, I can't stand your swallowing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does that mean? Just like, you know, I mean, like politically, like what does that mean if you're trying to revolt against something? Like you need to be.
What are you just biting back?
You have to be driven, and you can't take what's given to you, right? I prefer to be alone. I say with my food. You never used to look at me. It's true when I was, and you pointed this out to me too. Swallowing. You used that word, swallowing. You said. And the insatiability contained in the verb that made me despise the word.
Mm-hmm. I understood that my way of dealing with hunger was intolerable to you. Interesting.
Yeah. I'm hungry. I'm going to go make some rice as soon as this is over.
Sputter some grains out.
No cheese, though. I'm off the dairy. So.
Despicable grease.
No dairy, no cheese.
So I would love to hear you guys. Well, we can move to the next chapter, but one thing I thought was kind of cool in terms of situating us in the present time, right? Is when she talks, or whatever the present time is of the book, you know, when they're in the bed eating the rice, is, you know, talking about this century. So we can imagine that, okay, you know, we're going to be reflecting on events, revolutionary, leftist-led events of the 20th century, and now we're in a new century, the 21st century. And how does the narrator sort of characterize or define this new century that they're in?
This is a pop quiz, right? Because isn't there a line that's sort of along like that I'm looking for that I had underlined somewhere?
Okay, I got a lot of things underlined, but I feel like I'm being pedantic. But I guess I'll continue.
Please do, because I know that I have that marked too, and I can't find it.
Okay, so this is kind of, I think, one of the first references that's really interesting is, okay, on page 8, right? In the second large paragraph toward the bottom.
Yep. I have that underlined.
He said, I prefer not to say to you in this century. Okay, so we've got this century, don't smoke, etc. And then down, about halfway down, I don't say anything so as to preserve the listlessness that this century grants us, a gift that cannot be refused. And that's why we can use Franco to attenuate his fascism. No, you say, a Nazi. So it's like they're living in this century pretty much completely unmoored in terms of they're adrift, right?
I feel like that becomes like kind of a good way of summarizing the whole section, is that they're sort of just in a bed. They reference, it's on page like 18, but even though time doesn't stop flowing nor ever, still we live like militants, austere and focused on our principles. We think like militants. We're convinced our ethics are the only appropriate ones. Sounds familiar. We don't need to even need to discuss it within the cell into which we have transformed ourselves. We are a cell, a single clandestine cell cloistered in this room with a controlled, careful exit to the kitchen or the bathroom. So like that listlessness and that sense of like my feeling about it when you first asked that question, while I was trying to find the page, was that there was like a purpose, a very direct purpose prior to this century or whatever is being defined as this century. And then after that, it's like almost that it's their routine and their dedication, but they don't know to what.
Right.
As if like, and I do have this sense like with other, and maybe this is reading too many other revolutionary books and Marxist books in particular on top of this, of like that sense of failure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this book, for me, the way it's at least beginning, my sense of it is that it is in dialogue with that tradition of Latin American literature and other world literatures as well, but particularly Latin American literature that ruminates on, and this is something we talked about when we talked about 2666 last season, is that there's sort of a literary, really deep preoccupation with sort of like the leftovers of that revolutionary political exuberance and like I say violent commitment, not necessarily in terms of physically violent acts, but a very strict adherence to ideology and to the idea. I mean, in the fact, at its base was the idea that the world could be better. Like it's a bit, we sort of like we sort of speak a little bit flippantly of it now, but at the heart of it was the idea that there could be more freedom, there could be more rights, there could be more democracy. There was sort of a kind of truth, and that idealism. Where does the idealism end up? In bed with the crappy rice.
With shitty rice, yeah. It's 36 minutes into this. It's 36 minutes into this, and I can mention for the first time this season that always reminds me of the Pynchon core concept, and like Gravity's Rainbow in particular, of that there was a moment in time where things could have changed, and we lost. Yeah.
This voice,
the Simon and Garfunkel, and they have lines where like, "I have my poetry to protect me," and it's that idea of like, activism and art. Art's going to change the world, and it's like, yeah, you're just alone in bed.
No, right, and that there's a place of resistance, right?
Yeah.
But you know what changes things? Bullets.
It's like all the stuff that's going on. It's like all the reflections right now on the Republican Party as part of the Supreme Court leaked document related to Roe versus Wade. But like, yeah, it's like, how the fuck is this happening now? And like the people that like, if you are a crazy zealot, like you get your way.
I mean, I'm still
we're writing poetry and singing anti-war songs.
I know, but I'm still an idealist, and I still believe but I think there's kind of like this. There's almost like a little bit of that crass idea of like, yeah, these ideas are great and all, but for what? Do something.
Well, it's interesting.
The direct action versus analysis part.
I was going to say, and what she wants is that action. And what does she get? What is thrown right in her face? But Stalinist, extremist, crazy killer bitch, like a murderer essentially is what she's called by someone else, by Martine, right in the South, and she's talking too about the frustration, right, of like all the talk and all the discipline, and I think that this idea of like something escaping its borders, right? Her revolutionary spirit, her desire for change, the possibility of action is sort of like it's escaping the control of the other members of the cell, like her partner and the other men, I would presume, that were sort of leading the cell. The same way that like too much food, she's escaping the bounds of her body. And I think that's going to be very interesting to look at how that dynamic plays out, particularly with sort of, masculine and feminine energies, I guess, in this.
Agreed. So not to transition too abruptly, but using that maybe as a segue to the title, what would you have translated the title of without knowing that it was part of a poem, Katie? Jamás el fuego nunca?
I know you told me you were going to ask me that, and I don't have another answer. I probably would have done what Danny did. I mean, I don't know what I would translate it as. I think the first in the diary, he talks about it being never the fire ever. Right?
Correct.
Okay. So that would be, a literal translation in the sense that in the Spanish, it's two instances of two different words that mean never. Nunca
Right.
and jamás, which, we don't have, but to sort of, and we say nunca jamás means never ever, really. It's what we would express with, a more sort of forceful and definitive way of saying that. So I think and I don't know the story of the Cesar de Vallejo poem and if that was ever translated before Danny, or did Danny translate that intro fragment that opens the book?
I can't believe that he did, because that would be surprising to me that hadn't been translated before.
Yeah. Never did the fire ever. I love that. Never did the fire ever play its part better. This the dead cold. Cesar Vallejo.
I'll look into that, but
Yeah.
I would bet that had been translated before. And my best guess is that like if he's starting the way that he did with just getting into the book and going for it, might not even.
He didn't know. Right. He
poem
wouldn't have seen that.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And it would have
That's
been
a
in
really good point.
Spanish in the first time or in his version as well. So it wasn't
Yeah.
like it wasn't already translated, but then maybe I don't know, maybe he talks about it later on, but going into looking for that translation of that poem leads to this title, which I do think is better. I'm not sure, like, I think it's much better, but
Yeah,
I don't know if I've ever come up with it.
Can we discuss the translation there? Because since we have
Yeah.
Yep,
since we have a
let's do it.
translator,
That's why I wanted to switch. That was my transition. You're welcome.
what was it like for you reading? Like for me, it's kind of interesting. I'd like to see how the sausage is made. This is interesting. But
Yeah.
what is it like for you being an insider?
Oh, I'm loving it so far. Danny is so brilliant also. And I've done a workshop with him and met him several times in person in London. And he is such a generous spirit when it comes to sharing his expertise and teaching. And so like, I'm looking at this as like an instruction manual. Not that I would follow, exactly what he does, but that there's bits and pieces. Like, let's see, let me give you an example, Brian, specifically. I underlined something where I was like, oh, great. Yeah, I should do this.
No, it's like with writers. Like I love hearing where they're struggling with something and how they work through it, right? The problem solving or the.
I mean, I think one of the things that I think is most interesting to me in terms of the process and what he describes is how fast he works initially.
Yeah.
So the idea that for what works for him, and I think this works for me too, but I resist it a little bit, is to do really fast, crappy first drafts so that like you're flying through and you're not worried about what you're going to have to go back to. You're not worried about, precision or perfection. You're getting something down that then you will spend lots and lots and lots of time editing. And I do find that I work that way with my translations, and that, I go over them and over them and over them and over them and make a lot of changes over time. And I think this sort of reading that Danny works that way, I admire him so much that I think I'm going to be a little looser and faster with my first drafts. And
I was surprised to hear that you don't read first, but of course that makes sense. The original writer didn't read it first either.
And I tend to read first.
I'm the same. Even now writing, I'm really slow, and I've heard it said like so many times: get it down, then get it right. Yeah, and I think
because it's paralyzed, it can be really paralyzing otherwise, right? But I'm like, I don't always, if I'm doing a sample, obviously I don't read the whole book before I'm going to do a sample of something, like for an agent. But if I want to do a sample of a book that I personally want to kind of champion, I would read it first. But I think it's cool. What he's describing is really, really interesting. The idea of, there was one specific example of like, would the voice say it's or it is?
Yeah.
It's like, you don't know yet. If you had read the whole book and you already had sort of analyzed and had an idea of what that voice was going to be, you would be making those decisions sort of consistently from the beginning, right? But it's like, if you're discovering, like, you're going to have to go back and say like, all right, where are the places? Where will those decisions be made that then are going to have to be consistently made and tweaked throughout the whole manuscript? But I thought that was really cool. We talk a lot about his introduction in the interview. So maybe we don't talk as much about the introduction, but we talk a little bit more about some of the entries.
I noticed there's a repetition of like the paradoxical nature of translation. Found really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Lines like the new novel won't have any of the same words as the old one, but I'm hoping it will be otherwise the same book. Everything's going to be different, but it's going to be exactly the same. Or like, my job then begins with the gradual process of falling in love with it, changing everything while also preserving its essence.
And there was there was a beautiful description of, where is it? Okay, no, this is at the very end of the first entry, January 27th, the love at first sight, right?
Yeah.
When he talks about doing the first draft totally fresh, more closely resembles the experience of any other reader, right? But it's also got something of the experience of the writer discovering it in her first draft too, trying to keep hold of this thing while it's still moving, evolving, and that can be a thrilling ride. And Brian, maybe you could talk a little bit more about your process. Like, you said you're pretty slow. Like, are you very deliberate or?
Yeah, I don't like having to do a lot of editing, so I try to write really clean. But as far as like plot and discovery, if you overplot something, you can't surprise yourself. And so you have to go in a direction that's very obvious, or like if you're not going fast and trying to discover the ending as like racing towards that ending, you're not going to be able to surprise the reader, because you're not able to surprise yourself, and there's no discovery because you've already tried to figure it out, and you're just filling in the mile markers between your start and your end. But if you just sat out on the road and I'm not sure how I'll get there, but I've got gas in the tank, so let's go. Like that's the fun stuff. So.
And that's so interesting, because I think, I've heard other writers describe their process where that would be like, that would be absolutely crazy making for someone who plots everything and has like the Post-it note.
Exactly. Yeah. I can't.
Are you specifically thinking of Emily Hall's picture of her second draft of the long cut?
Yes.
Which, if you see on Twitter, she has all of her note cards that were laid out on the wall as to how they sort of repeat and connect.
E.L. Doctorow had like the slickest like explanation of like how to. He says like when you're driving at night, your headlights only go so far, but you'll make it all the way home if you just follow the length of the headlight.
Yeah.
And I always like that. That one worked. Like, you have an idea of where you're going, you can't see the end, but you don't need to, because it's just what's in front of you. And just
wasn't it? It might have been a Hemingway quote, but that you should always quit writing when you know what's going to be next. Like, quit for the day.
Oh.
So then you can start with something that you know was going to be the next thing and go from there.
But no, I found that like this aspect of the journal I found very inspiring for me, because I let like I'll allow the anxiety of not knowing what to do or how to do it just crush me from doing anything at all. And then instead of like productively procrastinate or something.
Yeah.
There's that idea of like just going after it with energy and like, I'll come back to it later. Don't worry about it. I really like that, like, which seems like bonkers for a translator to do that. Because I would assume it's like very, I see translators, and I'm probably totally wrong, but like I imagine them as like masons that are taking like, they're fitting this stone into the wall so that it'll be a nice fit, like, and everything has to be so precisely chiseled and perfectly placed. Versus just like, here, they'll fit, just pop them in there. We can come back.
Dash, put some mortar.
Yeah, like
peg it on.
Like I feel like because there's an art and a craft to it, but I really think of it like, to me, I'm thinking of it like this. Boy, the craftsmanship has to be so insane to get this right.
Well, and I think that points to the many stages, right? So, and in the introduction, he talks about constructing this thing as a series of concrete choices, right? Like a translation, but writing too, writing is a series of choices you make. You make one choice and that leads to the next choice, to the next choice, to the next choice. And I don't know, like, it seems like potentially with this sort of fast draft, you get in a flow that it doesn't necessarily have to be, like a divinely inspired flow. It can be, right? But it doesn't have to be, where, you're just moving through and you're not overthinking it, which is akin to a certain type of writing you can get into. And then there's going to be other moments where you are, you do have your hammer and your chisel and you're trying to fit something where it seems like maybe it's not going to belong, and you've got to take it apart again and rebuild it, using whatever material you can repurpose. And that, I think, is kind of, everybody is sick to death of translation metaphors, but I think the idea of, like, the material, you're using different materials to build. They're going to be in different formations, but there is something that you can sort of, like, scavenge from the wreckage of the original. I don't know. Now I'm going way off the rails with the metaphor. But
I have two comments on that. Well, one is, I think that both with writers and with translators, although the examples I can think of are more frequently involving translators, is that if you're overcrafting or overdoing it from the start, you tend to be more resistant to editorial input, and translation is inherently collaborative in a lot of different ways, and not just between the book and the translator, but between other players that are involved. And the same would go for authors who are open to, like, revising and improving and seeing things from another light, versus ones who are like, no, this is what it is. So, like, that clinging too tightly to, like, the perfect wall that you've built is right. Maybe a detriment. And that the looseness doesn't have to be, like, completely, like, flippant. Like, I think the counterpart would be like, I don't write like you guys write, but, like, the shit that I do write is not well thought out. It's not well crafted. It's mostly just a flow until there's, like, 4 or 5 moments where it's like, I want to nail one thing down. Yeah. But that brick wall is, like, jagged as shit. Like, I'm never going to get hired to build a thing. But, like, with like, I was speaking specifically with yours, Katie, with your work, I've seen it at various stages of the translation, and having it, like, at the first raw one where you're still, the voices are, like, there but not fully formed. They're still, like, in a larval stage, and then we talk about it and you end up, like, coming to, like, an idea of, like, oh, this person is more blank, or this is more the voice. There's a very specific example with the Franco sample that nobody else will have read, but does exactly this. But they will
read it eventually.
They will read it. They will read the finished version next year. They won't. Yeah, they won't read the first one where you're still, like, in the dark finding your way, and then having that be revised and figuring out, oh, it sounds like this. And then I've seen, like, after you've even done that, the going back to, like, after, like, a copy editing moment, going back to, like, very specific word choices and very specific, like, moments in the text, and changing the it to it is, or all that kind of stuff, is, like, those final details that, like, that by thinking of it more as a process, like he's thinking of it, frames the whole activity in a more generous and, like, productive light than solely, like, I did a translation, here is the translation.
Right. I also think that there's something about that, leaving and returning to any piece of work, any form of art, the going and coming back and seeing it in a new light, with a different perspective, is really, really important. And what Danny says on page 20, when he's talking about, all right, this is really great. Okay. My job then begins with a gradual process of falling in love with it, and then changing everything while also preserving its essence. But that sounds mysterious again, I know. So to put it another way, because Danny is cool. Like, he's sort of pushing back against this ephemeral idea of, like, a magical communion of the translator with the text. And he's saying, well, perhaps there is some degree of inspiration. I don't know if he even says that ever, but I believe that there can be, but also what happens is these really concrete moments of choice. So to put it another way, my job is to look closely at what the novel is currently doing by holding it up and turning it slowly so the light catches every syllable and comma. Here, I'm going to show you my geode. We're going to look at this amethyst, guys. That's the light, okay? And then to construct a new thing out of English words that holds as many of the same properties as I can manage. So that's a really gorgeous way of imagining it, you know, that you're talking about like a precious gem, and you want, you want to retain whatever properties you can after really careful observation. And I think for me, like, that's one of the most critical elements of you know, quote unquote, good translation, and good translators are people who read really carefully, and who do get to know the original work as best they can from all of those angles, and from moving it around so the light catches it in different ways and something else is revealed, and then trying to make whatever you're doing sort of behave in that same way, hopefully.
Related to that, there's one last quote I want to have, and then maybe we can sort of wrap up for today. But one of his other quotes in here is, because translators are individual interpretive readers and individual creative writers, rather than just lexicographical data sets or collections of algorithms, which is a nice way of putting that whole thing too. At some point, we should talk about why he's called Catching Fire, because I think that might be a metaphor too for that whole process of like the falling in love with the book and getting your translation to become like what you say, to be you want it to be fire. We all want to be fire.
We all want fire.
we all want that fire icon.
We all want that fire
flying
emoji
around. So
yeah, fire.
What did you say, Brian? A Spanish 3? was that what you referred to? No fire for you, Chad.
The Spanish 3. Yeah, but he did concede that you were a Latvian 7
and a Rochester 8.
I think that's probably where we should just end.
I love your banter, boys.
Okay, next week.
Here's our line of the day, real quick. I'll give you one line for the day.
Oh, yeah, line of the day.
Oh, yeah.
In short, don't be a translator. It's a very foolish thing to do.
My line of the day is actually the title of the line of the day is actually the title of the podcast, which is "You Behaved Like a Dog."
Yeah, that's really good.
I resemble that remark.
Where is that?
As who's not a dog fan.
You behaved like a dog. That's great. I don't know how to beat that one. Let me just see.
I mean, the other one I would choose is Stalinist extremist crazy killer bitch.
Yeah. I don't really have anything in particular. I think I've said all the things.
Okay. Well, for next week, we're going from page 21 through 44 in Never Did the Fire, and essentially page 25 to 52 in Catching Fire. So the two books are like, it's not 52 though. That's wrong, Chad.
What's the date?
Wrong. Oh, sorry. I did something wrong. Through 54. So 25 through 54 in Catching Fire for anyone who's paying attention.
Okay, and 21 through
44 and Never Did the Fire. These books are both almost the same length. Danny's is a little bit longer, but there's only 7 episodes this season, and they each are about like 45 pages of total reading between the two. So very short, but like, as you can see, we unpacked a lot in this and Never Did the Fire. And Danny's is always inspirational, especially when we get into the parts where he writes about like larger issues in translation in more detail. Like the introduction is fantastic, but I think we'll have even more to say as we get into his concrete examples. So anyways, one other thing. So again, sponsor us on Patreon, patreon.com/2month-review, all written out as a word. Also, Charco Press is offering 10% off to listeners of this podcast to anything on their website. You just have to use the code 2month-review at checkout. And you can do that. I think it's good through a week from Friday. So until like the 12th of May. So jump on that. And it doesn't have to be these 2 books, but anything that there's on their website, the bundles, the tote bags, all that kind of stuff. So go for it. Go forth and support Charco. Thank them for supporting this podcast in this way,
And for supporting
I guess,
translators in this way.
true. Any final jokes there, Bri?
Wait, they should stay, make sure people stay around and listen to the interview with Danny.
Yes,
That's
do that too. Because the
in the
interview,
podcast.
Danny and I talked to Danny for like 30 minutes about the introduction, about his background related to like theoretical translation studies and stuff like that. And it's fantastic. So listen to him. He's wonderful. He's great. And we will see you next week for part 2.
Okay, bye guys.